All right, now to the 2024 election where Virginians can start voting today. It's one of the first states to open early voting options. Our Stephanie Liebergen joins us now from another early voting state, Minnesota. And Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us here in Hampton Roads in northeastern North Carolina this morning. Let's talk about early voting because this has been something that's come up a lot in recent elections, especially back in 2020 with the presidential election and COVID. Now it's up again. How has it changed over the past few election cycles?
Hey, Anthony, good morning. Well, you're absolutely right. So early voting here in Minnesota, where you are in Virginia, and then also South Dakota and Vermont are the four states that start that early in-person voting today. And we have seen big changes in the availability of early voting options, the availability of vote-by-mail options over the last couple decades. Let's start back at the 2000 presidential election. That year, there were only 24 states that offered early in-person voting without any kind of excuse needed. Fast forward to 2016, that was up to 38 states in Washington, D.C. This year, there are only 3 states across the country that don't offer any kind of early in-person voting without an excuse. That is a big change over the last couple decades, and I think it just shows how Americans like having more options. Americans like not having to go on election day and potentially stand and wait in a long line. Having these early voting periods certainly can help turnout. You look at Minnesota, the state where I'm in today. Minnesota, the last few election cycles, has historically had the highest turnout in the country, turnout rates of up to 80%. For these key presidential elections, and they have basically a month and a half where Minnesotans can vote. And so it makes the process a little smoother for some states. It allows them to start tabulating some of those ballots earlier to make the count once the polls close on election day a little bit faster. So there certainly are benefits, and Americans have shown they like having those options. We saw that in the 2020 election, and I think we'll see that again in 2024 with Americans taking advantage of the early voting options when they can.
And of course, lots of races are going to be on these ballots that people are voting on as early as today. The top one, of course, the presidential race, Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Donald Trump. A number of new polls came out following their recent debate. What can you say the race looks like right now with that?
Well, the race still looks very, very close, whether you're looking at battleground states or you're looking at the polling nationally. So we are getting lots of polls every day now that we are in the final few weeks of this election season. And let's take a look at just one of the polls that came out yesterday. It was a Marist poll. It looked at battleground states, and in the state of Michigan, the vice president had a 5-point lead over former President Trump. In Wisconsin, she had a 1-point lead. In Pennsylvania, they were tied. That 5-point lead in Michigan was the highest lead of any of the polls that I looked at that came out yesterday. But most of these polls, a 1, 2, or 3-point lead, is often within the margin of error, which means this race is still a coin toss. It's still unclear. Nobody has a clear lead. And so it's still a very close race for president in the battleground states. And those are so important, of course, because of our electoral college vote system and the need to get to 270 electoral votes. So the election kind of moving forward from here, it looks like the vice president, if you look at the polling averages, she's been kind of inching her way up, gaining a little bit more of a lead in those polling averages over former President Trump. But by all accounts, we are still in for a very close race this year in the race for president, which means we need patience once polls close on election day. It might take a couple days, like we saw 4 years ago, to know who is going to win the presidency and who's going to move into the White House. So once those polls close, just remember, a little bit of patience. We might not know on election night, especially if the race stays this close.
All right, good stuff there from Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Our Stephanie Liebergen there, live from Minneapolis, Minnesota.